So this is my analysis video for my new film Unforgettable, basically breaking down all the different aspects of the film, the things that I did to get the film made, some of my intentions behind the story, behind the filmmaking. So basically what I'm going to do in this video is walk you through everything I did that led up to that final film. So out of all the different topic questions, I chose the connections. And I went about kind of coming up with ideas through some of the photos that I had taken in the past, looking at connections between man and nature, man and machine, machine and nature, seeing if these photos could be somewhat influential to the story, trying to come up with a kind of a visual language around those photos, and perhaps trying to make a story out of those photos. Because one of the things I knew I wanted to do going in was to show kind of the different sides of me as a filmmaker. I wanted to shoot a section in, black and white 4:3. I wanted to shoot a section in 185 in color. And so I wanted to have these stories connect to one another visually, contrast to one another visually, but also connect from a story perspective, from a character perspective, that one story has an effect on the other. They move in parallel, they start and end and kind of pivot at the same time. And ultimately that these different stories would come together to tell this one singular cohesive film, this one cohesive story, and explore these kind of connective themes and themes of connection, if you will, and together in a cohesive manner, while still being able to kind of have a different visual style about them. Once I had a relatively secure idea of the story and the tones, I then began to take some photos in the style of each section as sort of an experiment to see whether or not the kind of visual approach that I wanted to have would actually work. And actually, within the photos that I took, there were quite a few in which I would kind of adapt the composition and the lighting patterns to the film itself. So that was actually a really nice way of getting into the feel of the film before actually shooting it. And also, quite a few of the locations in which I took those photos would actually go on to be the locations I filmed in. So the script writing process was relatively simple. Unlike most of my other films, there is absolutely no dialogue here whatsoever. And so it was much more about capturing the emotions and the atmosphere through visuals and sound and music. And so I wrote the script knowing where I wanted to film. I wrote the script knowing where I wanted to cut. I wrote the script knowing which piece of music I wanted to use. And so it was a relatively simple process in terms of script writing. And I had done a lot of research in terms of location, in terms of kind of filmmaker influences. And so by the time I wrote the script, I had most of it already in my head. And so the transition from the ideas in my head to what I wrote on paper was relatively smooth and seamless. I also did some storyboards. These were relatively detailed and extensive, and they were also pretty simple, but just time consuming. So let's talk about the actual story itself, because it can kind of be somewhat confusing and ambiguous, and I just thought I'd clear it up a little bit. Basically what happens, if I were to walk you through the entire story, is that we start off with a murder. We don't know why this murder is happening. We don't know who it is that's being killed or who the murderer is. It's just a murder. And then we transition into the main sort of primary story, which is the story of the writer. He's writing two parallel stories, and we don't know why. We don't know what he's thinking about. We don't know what his sort of thought process is. He's just writing. And of course, as the story progresses, then we learn more about him. But essentially, these stories are the two completely different sides of him. Because if I were to sum up this film, if I were to sum up Unforgettable in one sentence, it would basically be, it's a boxing match between the good side and the bad side of his mind. And so the two stories and the two characters within those stories represent the good side and the bad side of his mind. The passive and calm and beautiful side of his mind, and the harsh, violent, but also passionate side of his mind. And then, of course, as the story progresses, we find out that the writer was in fact present in that opening murder. He witnessed that murder. It's given him something to write about, but it's also caused this dilemma within the character. He saw that the murderer has a scar on his on the left side of his neck. He saw who the murderer was, and the entire dilemma is whether or not he should track down this murderer, whether or not, if he were to find the murderer, would he kill him? Would he walk away, or would he kill the guy? Would he go down the bad way or the good way? And that is the central connection, that is the central conflict, the first one being the connection between a writer and his work, how a writer, kind of pours his heart and soul into his work, and there is very much his personality and his life experiences in his work, just as any artist really, whether you're a filmmaker or a musician or a painter, the things you experience in life will kind of seep through into your work. And that's connection number one. And the big connection number two is between good and evil, basically. Which way do you want to go? Which choice do you want to make? That is the second major connection. But aside from that, there are tons of connections throughout the film. Fight or flight, real world and fiction, life and death, just so many different connections. And with each beat that I wrote, I had to make sure that there was some sort of theme of connection in there, because I needed to kind of answer the the exam question, and that there is an actual connection within the stories. The stories themselves are connected, and so that is essentially what the story is about. That is essentially the kind of a detailed look at the story and the themes. And of course, as we get to the end, he does run into the murderer, and we don't know whether or not he goes through, whether or not he kills him or whether or not he walks away. But there are, of course, certain visual beats, certain character decisions within those stories that kind of clue you in as to what he does. But it was very important for me from the beginning that this story needed to be ambiguous, because that is part of the allure, that is part of what makes the story kind of intriguing, in my opinion. And in a weird way, I feel like the ambiguity actually increases the impact of the writer's decisions, because if you watch the film properly, if you kind of really dissect the visuals and the music and everything, you probably know what's going to happen. So let's move on to the influences. With each story being so drastically different from another in terms of style and visual style, each of the sections had different influences. So for example, with the writers section, of course I looked at kind of the old classic film noirs from Hitchcock, Wells, Billy Wilder, and there's definitely that influence on there. I knew I wanted to shoot 4:3 black and white from the very beginning, and of course I looked to those older films in order to sort of find how I would light these black and white scenes, how the composition would work when shooting in 4:3 aspect ratio. But of course I also looked to more modern films shot in 4:3, like First Reformed and The Grand Budapest Hotel, both of which were very inspirational for that section from a filmmaking point of view. But within the character himself, I showed my actor quite a few different films and quite a few different performances. I was inspired when I was talking to him by quite a few different films. For example, the first one would be The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, because he is a writer, and the main character in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Michael Blomsfisk, is a writer. So I based the look of the character, the costumes, off that film, and the performance as well. I showed my actors scenes from Seven in the desert scene, when Brad Pitt is kind of hesitant of whether or not he's going to kill Kevin Spacey. Is he going to take the right way or the wrong way? And that level of hesitation and that duality was something that I wanted my actor to capture in that final scene. I also looked at films like Rear Window, North by Northwest, Enemy, because in the film Enemy, it's really all about duality. It's about the two different sides of one man, and so that was really, really inspirational to me from a thematic perspective, but also visually as well. How you convey isolation, how you convey duality, all these different things. For A section, I'm going to call this character A. His scenes were influenced by the film Her, by Moonlight by Barry Jenkins, and by In the Mood for Love by Wong Kar-wai. And just that kind of style, that kind of film, something that's very colourful but also really melancholic. I wanted to, almost in a weird way, show isolation through just how cramped in the protagonist was within this gigantic spaces, almost trying to make wide shots feel like close-ups and close-ups feel like wide shots, if that makes any sense. And A's costume, the costume choices were a direct reference to Joaquin Phoenix's costumes in Her, with the pink shirt and the glasses and all the rest of it. So I really wanted to show these scenes in a way that felt really colourful and dreamlike and just beautiful, almost like something out of a Terrence Malick movie even. You could see him as an influence as well, to really contrast with kind of the still static nature of the writer's section, that being shot in 4:3 to kind of trap him into the frame, whereas the visuals in A section feel so free and liberating, and yet he feels kind of trapped. Now, the main influence for B scenes were Taxi Driver, Drive, and You Were Never Really Here. films about the kind of violent anti-hero, if you will, where the main character is not necessarily the nicest guy, doesn't necessarily do the nicest things, but you empathize with him, you see why he's doing what he's doing, you feel for the guy. And that's one of the things I really wanted to capture with B, was that there's a kind of warmth and passion to the violence. And so those films, in terms of visuals, in terms of tone, were really, really inspirational. I also based the look of B off of Joaquin Phoenix, also from You Were Never Really Here. He has this kind of dirty, rugged look. He almost looks like a bear in a way. And that was kind of the inspiration for B's scenes. But I would say, though, that the main piece of influence in terms of, if I had to pick one film to kind of say that this was the one that I was most inspired by, that would be Tom Ford's Nocturnal Animals, a film that also has 3 separate stories, in 3 separate timelines. It's a film basically about a story that takes place within a story, and that layered nature of it was something I wanted to capture. It was, in terms of the editing, in terms of the rhythm and the atmosphere that I wanted to capture with this film, kind of having all these stories have an effect on the other, to connect to another in a meaningful way. And those were all things that I really drew from Nocturnal Animals. So the filming took place over a relatively extended period of time. I shot all of B's scenes in one night. I shot all of the writer's scenes over 2 or 3 days. And I shot all of A's scenes in about 3 days and a couple of weeks later, because I had to fly home to Thailand to film those scenes. That was why I myself had to play A. I didn't really want to play him because I'm not that much of an actor, but it was the only choice that I had. There wasn't anything too complicated about the filming, because there weren't any sort of intricate action scenes, there wasn't any sort of amazing dialogue sequence where I had to figure out the blocking of each character perfectly. It was all in my head, it was all in the storyboard, so I could really just go ahead and do it in a simple way as possible. The visual language, the visual style of this film, it's very minimal camera work, camera movement. A lot of it is kind of still shots, because I wanted to show that, this being a story that takes place within, the mind of a writer, it needed to have sort of a storybook quality to it, so I didn't kind of move around the camera too much. But as I will cover in just a bit, the cinematography was very, very intentional. And I think that this is a film that in many ways is very reliant on the actors, their performances, and I was very lucky to have some pretty great actors working with me, some my good friends. And so when it came to working with the actors and the acting as overall, aside from my own performance, judging the rest of them, I would say that I felt really safe as a director, that they were kind of giving me the performances that I needed, that I wanted out of them, and so there was really no issues there whatsoever. From a cinematography point of view, this was something I was really excited to do, because I had never filmed in 4:3 before, and as I mentioned throughout the video, it's a very intentional choice. I wanted to kind of evoke that sort of film noir quality, while also making sure that the aspect ratio and the black and white kind of worked for the story, right? Because the black and white is a nice contrast to the colorful nature of the stories that he's writing, and the 4:3 aspect ratio shows that he is kind of trapped within the confines of his imagination, within the trauma that he experienced from seeing that murder. So that was why I did the 4:3 black and white for the writer sections. And for A and B, this was all about contrast. I framed A almost exclusively on the left-hand side of the screen. To really draw the audience's eyes to that side of the screen. If you drew a line right down the middle of the screen, you'll notice that A is almost exclusively on the left with 1 or 2 breaks, and B is almost exclusively on the right. A is looking from left to right, and B is looking from right to left, just to really show the contrast between the two. And this was just another subtle suggestion to the audience as to who was right, because usually in our daily lives we associate left to right as the way forward. We read from left to right. In most films, the good guy is always positioned looking from left to right, and the bad guy vice versa. So just as a subtle suggestion that the good guy is left to right and the bad guy is right to left. Now this was also reflected in the color palette. A is these highly saturated blues, greens, purples. It looks like a dream, it looks like an illustration, like a painting. That's really what I was going for. And with B, it's much more gritty, it's harsh, but it's also warm and passionate. It's reds, it's oranges, it's yellows. And so you really see the personality of each character through the colors that I used with them. And that was really how I showed the character arcs, because A, for example, starts off blue, beautiful beach, and then he goes kind of slightly warmer in these kind of purplish pinks. And by the time he's at the boxing match, you know, the chair's red. Instead of looking left to right, he's looking right to left, to almost show that he has descended into B's world. He's kind of slowly going into the world of violence. And by the end of A's story, it's kind of these harsh oranges that you see in B's story. And so that's one of the connections right there. That's one of the things that kind of shows his descent into darkness. And that's one of the things that, you know, being that the stories have an effect on the writer, it almost shows that the writer himself is descending into darkness, that the good side of his character is fading, if you will. As again, that's sort of a suggestion as to how the story ends. There are also a couple of simple camera placements that I did just to kind of really hit home the points that I wanted to convey. For example, you know, if you want to show someone as powerful, you shoot them from below, and if you want to show someone as weak, you shoot them from above. If you want to show someone as cool, calm, and collected, you shoot them from a tripod. Or if you want to show someone who's in a sense of panic and unease, you might want to shoot them from handheld, which is what I did in the final shot, which I believe is one of only 3 shots in the entire film which is shot on handheld. I knew relatively early on that I wanted to use Max Richter's November as the primary piece of music. First of all, I knew that I needed a really kind of bold and outstanding piece of music to cover the large chunk of the story, and I knew that I needed moments of just silence to really show the contrast, show connection through contrast. And I knew that I wanted Max Richter's piece November because I needed something that was intimate but also epic. I needed something that was powerful but also quiet and melancholic. And that music just fit those themes, those ideas that I had completely perfectly. I also liked it because this piece of music isn't composed for a specific film or for a specific episode of TV or whatever. This was just a piece of music, and so it wasn't composed with certain beats, with certain moments in mind, meaning that I could really put my stamp on it as a filmmaker, that I wouldn't be forced to kind of edit around the music and edit to the beat of the music, and that the music would flow to the story as opposed to the other way around. So that was really nice. Now, some other potential pieces of music that I was going to use were Dr. Ford, a piece by Ramin Djawadi for the Westworld score, which is outstanding. And Wayward Sisters from the Nocturnal Animals score, which is also absolutely a stunning piece of music. But I thought that Max Richter's had the best feel, the best tone, and evoked what I wanted to capture in the best way. The editing process was relatively complex because I had to juggle 3 different stories going on at the same time. I had to make sure that you kind of saw the connection. I didn't want to make it way too obvious, but I just wanted to suggest certain effects, certain visual beats, certain cues that kind of clued you into the connections between each story. For example, all 3 characters, at one point you see a close-up of glasses, and I rarely use close-ups in this film because when you use a close-up, you're basically telling the audience, look at this is important, you know, focus on this. And it's a bold statement when you use a close-up, I find. I got a close-up of the gun, because, you know, that's a pretty important motif. I closed up on the glasses because that's one connective tissue, and the glasses almost serve as sort of like a metaphor for the writer kind of letting his guard down, letting his shield down, kind of becoming himself, if you will. And so I needed to make sure that when I was editing some of these close-ups, some of these shots, that they felt like they were connected to each other, despite the fact that the visuals were so, you know, drastically different. And when it comes to intercutting, when it comes to juggling different storylines and different beats, no one does it better than Christopher Nolan, in my opinion. So I really looked to him as an editor and looked at how he crafts these sequences through different stories having an effect on one another. He does this in a lot of his films, and really effectively, in my opinion. He does this to sort of show the connection between different sequences. And that was something I really looked at. The other aspect of the editing that was quite challenging for me was crafting tension. How do I show one guy pointing a gun at the other guy and make that feel intense? And I looked at a lot of Hitchcock films, I looked at a lot of Tarantino films, I looked at Fincher, I looked at Nolan, I looked at a lot of different films in which you have these standoffs, and of course I looked at spaghetti westerns. I looked at all Sergio Leone's films, the shootouts. How do you build tension? And for me, one of the important things was rhythm and shot length. For example, the opening shot of the film is 5 seconds long. The second shot is 5 seconds long. And once you see the murderer, it becomes 2 seconds 20, and then 2 seconds 10, and then 2 seconds. And it almost feels like a pyramid, starting off with longer shots and then kind of building up to shorter shots through kind of decreasing the shot length to really create the tension. Basically suggesting to the audience that something intense is happening, everything's getting quicker, the pacing is getting faster, it's the build-up's happening. That was quite an important part for me. And in the ending scene, to kind of really bring the story full circle, I was sure to kind of add a shot of A and a shot of B to kind of finalize the idea that these two sides of the writer are playing an integral role to his decision-making process, that he's either going to walk away or he's going to finish off the bad guy. What are you going to do? And that final shot kind of, in my opinion, those two shots of A and B show the audience the effect that the fiction has had on the fact, that the writings have had an effect on the writer. And that, for me, was really, really important. There was also very minimal color correction. I'm not the biggest fan of color correction because I believe that it's always best when you capture everything you need on set, on location. And so the shots that I color corrected were just simply to kind of match with the other shots within that scene, because the sun was coming up or the sun was going down, and I just had to get that kind of lighting consistency. The final thing I guess that I need to touch on is the credits scene, because I would say that there is kind of a meaning behind that, because the final shot is really intense and just filled with dread and despair and a kind of uncertainty and unease. I needed to kind of just give the audience a breath of fresh air. I cut to black, and the audience gets a chance to breathe. They feel cathartic about it, but the waves just kind of washing, away, because water has this kind of connotation of cleansing, right? And so I didn't want to be too pretentious, but it does, not only is it a nice visual, but it also kind of shows that whatever happened is that the water's kind of cleansing it away, that you're getting this sense of relief and catharsis from it. So that was really why I ended up using the footage that I took at the beach and as the end credit sequence. And the title of Unforgettable was something that I decided on relatively later on in the process. I had quite a few different titles in mind, one of which was Violent Passivity. I was going for that for quite a while, and then I thought it was just way too pretentious. I also had The Man Who Saw Too Much, but that just sounded a lot like a Hitchcock film, The Man Who Knew Too Much. And so I went with Unforgettable. It is, in my opinion, a pretty cool title. It's just one word, it's a bold statement, and it also works for the story because, of course, what the writer saw was just unforgettable, and so unforgettable that he had to write 2 stories about it. So thank you very much for watching my breakdown and analysis for Unforgettable. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed making it, and thank you very much for watching. Thank you. As in, back to where you were. Sorry.
Back to what? Yeah. So,
sorry, my fault. So just breathe.
You got up too close. You invaded my personal bubble.
Basically.
Oh wait. Oh fuck. Sorry.
Yeah, you got that's good. That's good. Shoot him. Bam. He's dead. And he's walking away, and then oh shit, mate, you got out. You went out of frame. You went out of frame.
That's my nose. I only grazed it, right? Did I only graze it?
It's fine.
I'm sorry. I tried really hard not to hit your face.
Right, well this will be going on the blooper reel.
Did you get it?
Yeah, I did get it.
Shot. Did you get
yeah, I did.
Okay, that's a shot. That's my face. Sorry, bro.
Lahaj, stay on the ground. Stay on the ground.
Quite good.
Lahaj,
Can I see that?
Yeah.
Wipe it all over. Oh, that's it. That's perfect.
You gotta get a shot of my hand when I'm dead as well.
Yeah.
Mate, keep going.
I can't believe I'm literally Leonardo DiCaprio. Like,
keep going because the blood's gonna dry soon.
Alright, Jasper, get on the ground.
Can you keep rubbing on your face just a bit more?
Get on the ground. We'll get the shot of you punching Lahaj first.
Wait, who's that? It's just it's gonna dry a tiny bit more. Just like wipe it, like sort of just like smush it around.
Like this?
Yeah, like that.
He looks like Sid, mate, from fucking Ice Age.
You need to go over.
Fuck off! I've just been hit in the face for you.
Like this.
You need to get blood in his nose.
I got blood in my mouth.
Go. He's lying there dead.
Yeah, let's go.
Sorry, Large, for rushing you, mate. You've taken a bullet for the team, mate.
Yeah, you have. Get down.
But that can be in your bloopers, mate.
Wait, one more. How much blood did I fucking bleed? Jesus Christ.
Right, do that again. Do that again. Do that again.
To say, are you okay? But it looks like.
He's alright. It's just part of the.
Who might that be?
Is he meant to hit me?
No, he's not meant to hit you because he doesn't know who you are. Dude,
I just walked past my
Accidentally him.
because you're literally in the middle of the fucking car. How often am I supposed to fucking?
I know. I think I looked at the camera. Can you look at the camera? It's not good. Okay.
We're not making behind the scenes commentary for it.
No, I know. I'm just talking to myself. I don't know. Do you want a polo?
Yeah, go on.
Faggot.
No, I'm good. Mate. Right, ready?
Can you stop calling me a faggot?
You are though.
This is on-set bullying and harassment.
Yeah, I'm like you're Shelley Duvall. I'm fucking
Stanley Kubrick.
Stanley Kubrick. I'm gonna bully the fucking shit out of you.
Right, go.
I'm fucking wet. No,